So, the war of facades. The panelists are having to do tag team with the microphones, so it does take a little bit of time. So, Adrian, I want to start with you, but I don't want to start with flammable panels. Inevitably, the discussion, particularly in the UK at the moment, is about Grenfell Tower, and understandably so, and flammable panels. And of course, we've had some issues here in Dubai as well with flammable panels. But frame the discussion more generally. We're talking about the war of facades, what it takes to be a winner. Let's start with that positively. How would you frame that debate or an answer to that question?
Well, as you know, Jonathan, we've had this terrible fire in London with 72 people actually have died, and obviously that's a huge loss of life. I think we have to keep it in perspective. There's fires in buildings all the time, and they're usually suppressed with no loss of life. But nevertheless, it's led us to really have quite a rethink in the UK. So we've really begun to get concerned about the materials that we use in facades. And that's just not just the rain screen materials, it's the whole build-up of the construction. And so I think we're having to have a little bit of a think again about how we test those materials and how we can still enable innovation and interesting architectural design whilst keeping a safe environment for the people that live in those buildings.
Let's almost take a step back, though, and sort of define what we mean by facades. Because when we talk about panels, and the debate often goes back to them, that is something that you stick on a building, essentially. It's decorative in some ways. Of course, that's not the only definition of a facade. How would you define facade, or the different types of facades? Give us some parameters here.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Jonathan. It's about the external wall construction. So there's a lot of focus on the moment on what's called rain screen panels, because it's these ACM panels that have come under suspicion, if you like. But that also usually requires an insulation layer behind. So what's the nature of that insulation? You're seeing there's a big change in fashion at the moment that actually what we might have traditionally called curtain walling is increasingly being used on a whole range of different types of buildings. And curtain walling throws up a whole different set of issues. So it's quite complex, actually.
And Sandra, if I can turn to you as well. Again, in terms of facades, we're talking about what it takes to be a winner here. So really all bets are on. How do you approach this, the idea of facades? How do you define what a facade is? How do you categorize the different types of facades, and what are you leaning towards?
I think currently the leaning is perhaps towards facades that are kinetic, they're responsive, and they're adaptable. It's very important these days to be able to have facade technologies, have facade engineers part of your team so that they can support the designers who, because of these softwares and the ideas that are available today, we can create much far complex geometries in our designs, on our facade designs than ever before. So today we're dealing with materials and using different kinds of materials that perhaps we haven't come across in the past. And the facade of today today's a tremendous time to be a designer and to work with teams who can put together use facades that can facades are getting digital. We can embed microprocessors, we can embed sensors and actuators into facades at the moment, and we have facades that respond to the environment they're sat in, the weather, the time of day, the sun path. I mean, we look at Al Bahar Tower in Abu Dhabi and how the facade there moves and changes throughout the day. It's adaptable, and it returns back to its original geometry at the end of the responsive processes. So facades today they're becoming living skins of the building envelope, effectively, I think.
There's an element, I mean, I remember thinking back to, in particular, Christina's presentation. Christina's still here. And you said there was an element of accidental design in the impact that the facade had of the tower. Obviously, a lot of it was planned, but the kind of ombre effects and an element of it just surprised you, but because you played with different ideas and materials, different impacts arrived, which I thought was interesting. Chris, again to you, just set some parameters. How are you approaching or defining facade design? And how has that changed over the years?
I think facades have got to work a lot harder now. Obviously, as architects, we tend to secure work through tender or competition. We win a lot of work through competition. So, and one of the biggest issues of competition is renderings or a movie which focuses on the look of the building. But the building has to, nowadays has to incorporate lots of different technologies. Intelligent facades are key. But there are other aspects of that in that we live in 24-hour cities and buildings have to react to different climatic conditions, but also different time constraints and experiences throughout a day. They change, they are adaptive, and they incorporate different technologies that allow buildings to do that. Equally, they can also be revenue generating, and that you can be hosts for artwork and incorporate various elements of not just the standard materials, but media screens and what have you. And we're working on a tower in Dubai right now that incorporates a lot of those different materials and responds in very different ways at different times of day. Equally, we're looking at different coatings like titanium dioxide, where we have that on 2 faculty buildings in China, which actually absorbs, is a sequester for pollutants and can actually clean the air around the building itself. And then equally, we have an algae farm in the studio that we're prototyping right now, which helps us to obviously absorb CO2 and then generate a biofuel, which is something else that we're working with one of the universities in Asia on.
And if I could turn to you, David Daniels of SSH, just to round it off, in terms of how the approach to facades has changed in your career and how you think it's going to continue evolving over the coming years.
Yeah, I'm similar to the colleagues on the stage, basically. I think when I first started in architecture, facades were very simplistically, they were an encompassing element to the overall building. I think where we're going now, though, is facades are actually becoming intrinsic to how the building works, that function, that adaptability. That's now actually become just as important to how the inside of the building is working as well, how the floor plates operate, how the VT operates and that. So, exactly as Sandra was saying, facades that are actually dynamic, that can actually change, not just with environmental impacts, but also with user impacts as well. Things we're looking at the moment is how individual elements of the facade can actually kind of change depending upon how the occupant behind that facade wants their space internally to actually from a light point of view or a heat point of view. So for us, the integration of the facade into the overall strategy of the building is much more important than it was, say, 10 years ago.
How have things like LEED or Estidama, or even things like well building certification that's becoming increasingly popular, how are they changing this, Sandra, these kind of certifications? Maybe they're not.
They're needing to. They're developing as the way that materials have been put together are developing. We need to look at the building envelope holistically these days, not just as in the past it was an elevation, a roof, and maybe a podium below. This was it. Today, we've got far more components that make up the building facade. We've got far more expectations of those facades. And when it comes in terms of looking at green building codes, each rating system, etc., is all very different. And so we need to look at how we can progress, develop these codes that can keep up with the development in technologies and materials that we're hoping to use as it goes along.
Of course, cost is a part of that. You can have all the great ideas, and then the value engineering starts, and you end up with polyurethane panels because they're the cheapest. How do the economics impact facade design, and then which facades actually get built?
That's a question that all clients ask, and that's a question which all designers bang their head on the door as they're leaving the client offices, because it is so very, very difficult. When a client can understand the value of the elements that you're proposing.
When did a client ever understand value?
When they can understand this value, then when it comes to value engineering, the elements which they understand the values of and what's going to give them much more from the actual cost of it for the future of the building, then they understand in terms of value engineering what elements of the project to concentrate on, to reduce or to alter.
And Chris, again, your experience of that, I mean, you outlined very quickly 2 or 3 what sound like creative, innovative, reasonably advanced technological approaches to facade design, but I'm sure there's a cost that comes with that. How do those conversations play out throughout the design process?
There is a cost associated with it, but it's also largely driven by time, because it's actually more to do with the thinking time and the time to prototype new ideas. So if you have a client that's generous enough to give you an extra 30% in the design stage to actually allow you to test the market and to prototype, then you can absorb those at a slight cost, not necessarily a heavy premium. But I think equally there's just the simple passive design moves that you can make. I think oftentimes we become too obsessed with technology, and actually simple things with facades like self-shading and orientation, a lot of our architecture is defined by those moves that we have adopted, particularly in a climatically adverse region such as MENA, where just straightforward, smart decisions about passive design actually can save the client a lot of money and then afford you an opportunity to look at some prototyping of other more advanced technologies.
David, what's been your experience in different types of buildings, public versus private, and again, different geographies and climates? Where are you mostly active?
I'd just like to touch on what Chris was saying. I think the thing about time is super critical, and it's something that we struggle with the most, is the need for having everything yesterday. And it really does have a massive impact on the quality of a building. That pushing, that prototyping, that exploring the design process, that is super. To go back to what you were saying though, with kind of what's our experience with cost and value, I think the key word is that value thing. I think as architects, as designers, as a collective of consultants to our clients, we have the responsibility to explain to them that value isn't just about the financial cost. A little bit of an additional investment within the building can actually increase their return on the building in the long term. Too many times I think we're too quick to just accept the client's wish to cut costs because we're worried about losing a job. Unfortunately, that's the state of the market. But I think, as a profession, we need to kind of push back a little bit. And when we do push back, I think that's when good architecture is made. When there's that conversation, there's a mutual respect at the table between the consultants that the client has approached and the client to have a conversation that might get heated. That's when a great product can actually be delivered at the end of the process.
What initiates distinction and innovation is often the time, but also I would go out on a limb here and say we've had greater success with our private clients than we have with public bodies, simply because they're often constrained. There are restrictive design guidelines. There's a bottom line that they have to meet. So they don't, and they're not necessarily in charge or singularly in charge of decision making. So when you get a private client that has that kind of empowered position and is an architectural patron, then you can develop an idea in a much more agile way. And that would, I think that drives innovation, particularly in this market. And it's a market where innovation is very prominent. I mean, our studios based in the UK and Asia, they love working on jobs in MENA. They absolutely love it because oftentimes they are less hamstrung, and they can do more with the brief, and they can interpret the brief in a much more open and dynamic way, and that gives birth to innovative work.
I was going to ask my colleagues, do you think there's a kind of leadership role for architects here? Because I think a big concern in the UK is that value decisions are often driving down quality, and we see that's because we've got a very fragmented industry. The architect's no longer the guiding hand. We rely more and more on specialists, whether it's facade design, fire engineering, cost consultancy. Have we lost a kind of leadership role, and do we need to be a bit more confident about explaining how these things integrate together to deliver value?
I think definitely architects they've diluted their presence in the room, shall we say. But I think there's a great opportunity there, is exactly that, to become the kind of, I like the analogy of kind of like a general practitioner. He knows a little bit about everything, but you know where to send your patient if he's got a heart problem or if he's got an eye problem or something. And so controlling that process, that is exactly what, as architects, I think we should be doing. We should be commanding the presence in the room to advise, but to send them to the right people, because we can't, the way design is now, the way the built environment is developing, we can't know everything like in the old days.
It comes down to two things in our experience, not dissimilar to what David just said, and that's the appetite the individual firm has for risk, and the appetite you as a design firm have to take that risk, and the proximity to the ultimate decision maker. If you are separated through layers of project management or tiers of different advisors, then you are less likely to have an engaging kind of, and ultimately it impacts on the product in a negative way.
The reason I asked was I've just been reading this book by Gillian Tett, who's the Financial Times journalist in New York, and it's called The Silo Effect, and it's all about how the financial crash, the financial industry was very siloed. There were lots of experts that understood all the little bits, but nobody could see the big picture, and that's why, they had to write, I think the economist at the LSE had to write a letter to the Queen to explain why the financial crash had occurred, and they said because we were too siloed and we were too reliant on specialists, there was no overview, and clearly that's what the architect should be able to offer.
Happy to take some comments or questions on this. We've got 5 or 10 minutes left. Who's got comments or questions on this? Who's got experience of facade design? Yes, please, sir. Let me come to you. If you could introduce yourself, that would be great.
Hi, my name is Ibrahim. I'm working I'm a facade specialist. I'm working here in Buchtal, Germany. And I'm asking if you can share some stories about the challenges with the clients, about the value engineers and how to deliver a better quality products for the facade cladding. Because this is a really big issue in the design right now, the facade design right now in UAE. Especially CRESS, because you have worked with the titanium dioxide. We are the titanium dioxide in UAE, but there is a lot of challenges of that to apply in the projects.
I think some of the answer to your question goes back to the kind of procurement methodologies that we use at the moment. The decision-making can be changed at every point in the process, so there's very little see-through from beginning to end. I don't know whether that's certainly the case in the UK. I don't know whether it's the same in this context or not, but that lack of continuity, so decisions are being changed all the time, not without reference back to the original reference design.
Yeah, I think continuity plays a huge part in that, and that you want to be in a position, certainly as architects, where you're engaged for the whole process. There is a natural divide line between pre-contract and post-contract in the region, where you're serving a client and then ultimately potentially a contractor in a D&B route, or a client with a different team with you, or even sometimes without you. Having a continuity of voice and a continuity of detail and design and authorship is key, but often that just comes down to commercial pressure. And the market is structured here in such a way that there are firms that distinguish themselves as post-contract delivery firms and pre-contract design firms, whereas actually what you want is both, and you want to be good, equally good at both, and supported by the market in that regard. And certain procurement routes actually support that, and some don't.
A couple of comments from our previous panelists, from Jean-Paul and Christina.
Thank you. I'm not quite sure I understand why we're isolating a piece of an entire design. A facade responds to a program and is an expression of the concept of a building. I'm not experienced with clients that only ask for a facade but not for a whole system inside. How does this work? I'm a bit confused.
I'll take the comment from your fellow panelists as well, and then we'll address them both. Christina.
Mine is completely in a different direction, so it might be difficult to answer both. But if you look at technology, which is what you guys deal with, and innovation, and if you look at the smartphones and the electric cars, and it's exponentially moved faster than buildings have done. And we have a problem that we as consultants are not the receiving end of the economics of a building. So in terms of, yes, there are firms that have research and development, but not with the kind of funding that Apple has, or not with the kind of funding that Tesla has. And so the way we build is completely archaic, let's face it. I mean, I know that we have moving facades, etc., but we're still building with steel and concrete, and it takes a long time, etc. How do we get around this problem of being able to catch up with Apple and Tesla in your field?
Two questions of separate issues. One, why are we just discussing facades independently? Is that a spurious notion? And secondly, R&D, I guess, within this industry. Adrian, sorry.
I'd have a go at the first one. I actually absolutely agree. I think it's a symptom of this fragmentation. I thought it was very interesting that Jonathan put up the World Trade Center Tower and said that it was an iconic building of its time, and maybe it's not seen it, maybe it's out of fashion at the moment, but that would have been at an era when there was a guiding hand, and actually the facade design, it's quite a heavyweight facade, but actually it probably was designed quite well for the local climatic conditions. It's clearly integrated with the rest of the design in the building, and I think that is a risk. I think it probably goes back to that kind of high-tech generation, doesn't it, that we were all in pursuit of very lightweight skins, and we've become slightly obsessed and treat it as a skin often.
Another point on R&D. I know, Chris, you picked up on this. Some of the more innovative technologies that you're using, I've forgotten the names, but remind us of some of the technologies, and maybe speak to the point that Christina made. Are we as an industry investing enough in R&D in these products?
No, we're not, because we don't. Oftentimes, there isn't the appetite or the finance to do that within certain companies. But I think we try and append ourselves sometimes aggressively to academic institutions, and so we will trade with them in terms of mentoring or lectures, and they will in turn support our research and development, and that's an absolute key thing. And it's also a very democratic way of doing it, and you can open yourself up and engage with that whole sector, the education sector, in a very positive way. How do we get to the level of Apple? Well, we'd start needing to designing smart machines and smart tools, I think, probably. But as architects, as a consultancy, that is the way that we adopt R&D approach. And then obviously enlighten clients, as I said. And then to the former question about facades, no, absolutely not. I don't think it's a singular of a singular importance any more than any other aspect of the building. But my point earlier was specifically about the subjectivity of clients, and certainly in terms of the amount of external views and renders we're asked to produce, they can often be driven by that decision of what something looks like.
They could be the hero shots that are going to win or lose.
They can, and you want to talk them through a plan, and you want to talk clients, and so it's not all clients, it's not a derogatory statement, it's just actually by nature of experience, what we see is a lot of decision making based on what something looks like rather than how it performs.
Do you find this, Sandra, that isolating the facade and too much attention on the facade, particularly when selling a concept or selling a project, is it common?
I think many clients just buy a pretty picture. I do agree. But I think the importance of looking at a facade and in terms of how it can make the functionality of a building. We had a project almost 3 years ago now. It completed out in the western region of Abu Dhabi. So it was a large complex, and one of the main ingredients of this scheme was a radiochemistry laboratory. Now, the design of a radiochemistry laboratory requires, it was for environmental testing. It was part of the new nuclear energy program coming out of Abu Dhabi. And the design of a radiochemistry laboratory requires the space to be cementitious free. So we designed a building which had no concrete blocks, no screeding of any kind. Effectively, the ideal solution for the laboratory was to produce a steel-framed glass box, which we then placed in the desert. So as we all know, this is not the ideal solution for a desert environment, to have a building that would actually work as anything. Nonetheless, the typology of the building that it was. So we then had to look at many, many ways of creating facade and envelope around that glass box, which would allow it to work as a building first and a laboratory primarily also. So we chose the glass carefully, high-performance glass. The technical term is a smoky blue. Well, that's what came out of my office anyway. We used fitted glass. We had contemporary Mushrabia screens. we elevated the site above the ground. We looked at, we've done lots and lots of work in this region for over 30 years, so we've got a lot of track record of understanding what works and why. So we based a generation's worth of work and developed what we did know, putting it into this scheme out in the desert. We raised the site so that the development was elevated, which took advantage of the winds from the Gulf shoreline, which was adjacent. We then looked at introducing water sources, so pools of water, so that the winds that blew across the development would then pick up the droplets of water, which when they hit the glazed facade of the glass box would evaporate, and we'd have evaporative cooling. We introduced breathable wall. Based on what Hassan Fatih described in the 80s as being a wall which allowed air through it and which captured the moisture out of that air. So we had a glass box, we built a sandstone cavity breathable wall, which we extended all the way across the central roof as a spine to the glass box.
Where is this structure?
This is just outside Ruwais. Unfortunately, even I don't have the badge to get back in there now because it's such it's part of the nuclear energy program. And this was actually the first building of that program that needed to be up and running in order to test the radionuclides in the environment before plutonium was allowed to come into the country. So
Plutonium is a different league of complexity, isn't it?
Very different project than what most projects are in Abu Dhabi. So we took this spine across the top of the building. It was a sandstone cavity breathable wall. So all the direct heat from the sun was dissipated through this through this spine. We had Bagdir holes throughout the construction of it, so that the vertical parts then acted as wind towers, as we've taken from the earlier construction solutions. That's common in the Gulf area around here, and we put an awful lot of effort and ideas into creating in modern contemporary terms a space which was usable for a function which had never before been required here in the UAE or in the GCC. And we based it on traditional building techniques and construction that is sustainable and was used by the Bedouins for generations in the area. So yes, the facade, we cannot separate the facade as being part of the overall volume of the building, which makes it work. But you can see from various examples where the function of the building is very explicit in the facade. Or maybe in some facades, only nuclear scientists can actually see that.
A fabulous example on which to end this discussion. Thanks very much indeed. Let's show our appreciation to our panelists, to Sandra, to Chris, to David, and also to Adrian. Thank you very much indeed.